The public is trained to look at the sky, to watch for the missile launch. This is a fatal miscalculation. The primary vector of systemic warfare is not a kinetic event. It is silence. According to CSIS threat models, over 95% of global data and financial transactions travel through a network of undersea fiber optic cables. These are the unprotected arteries of the world system. Severing them requires no nuclear launch code. The kinetic cost is nearly zero. The economic consequence is absolute. The second vector is orbital. Not crude anti-satellite missiles, but non-kinetic blinding. High-powered lasers, GPS spoofing, distributed signal jamming. The objective is not to destroy the asset, but to sever its connection to the ground, to create strategic cataracts. This two-pronged assault on the information architecture creates the blind Leviathan. A hegemon, its capacity for symmetric warfare already declining due to internal solvency crises, source number 4, is now stripped of its senses. It is immensely powerful, yet deaf and sightless. It cannot verify threats. It cannot trust its own data. In this state, the protocol defaults to launch on warning. For an adversary who cannot compete symmetrically, this asymmetric escalation is the only logical counter-move. By weaponizing silence, they force the Leviathan to trigger its own terminal protocol. The accelerant for nuclear confrontation is not aggression. It is induced blindness. The motive is not conquest, it is solvency. A nation-state, stripped of its flag, is a balance sheet. When domestic liabilities, pensions, debt service, social entitlements exceed productive capacity, the system requires a hard reset. This is not political theory. It is accounting. The historical blueprint is irrefutable. We watched it in Venezuela, a nation that drowned in oil wealth before its liabilities consumed it from within. This is the primary vector for systemic collapse. This war must be viewed through the lens of a solvency crisis. Authoritative analysis from CSIS, later reported by Forbes, reframed the entire conflict. It was not a war of choice, but of grim necessity. The calculus showed that the kinetic cost of a prolonged symmetric campaign was economically unserviceable against mounting domestic liabilities and the political poison of an unpopular mobilization. The objective was never a simple military victory. The strategic pivot was therefore a mathematical certainty. When a power cannot afford symmetric warfare, it is forced to initiate asymmetric escalation. The blueprint is to weaponize the system itself, to create a global repricing of energy, food, and security. This is not a military campaign. It is a hostile takeover of the global risk environment. The goal shifts from overpowering the adversary to bankrupting their political will. This mechanism, weakness forcing a pivot to asymmetry, is the accelerant. As a hegemon's own domestic solvency erodes, evidenced by internal decay like the housing crisis cited by Federal Reserve officials, its capacity for sustained, expensive conflict evaporates. It is then cornered by the same logic. It must pursue high leverage, kinetic gambles to project power it can no longer afford. This is the protocol that puts the entire globe on a launch-on-warning posture, where internal economic liability becomes the primary trigger for global confrontation. The kinetic cost curve has inverted. A $5 million main battle tank, the symbol of symmetric industrial warfare, is now a systemic liability. It can be located, tracked, and neutralized by a $500 drone. This is not conjecture. Analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, confirms this catastrophic cost asymmetry. This economic inversion is termed the democratization of violence. It signifies that the capacity to project decisive, destructive force is no longer monopolized by states with trillion-dollar defense budgets and complex supply chains. The barrier to entry for lethal kinetic action has collapsed. For a hegemon struggling with internal solvency, this is the terminal variable. Its high-cost legacy platforms, carriers, fighter jets, armored divisions, become exceptionally high-value targets for adversaries who can deploy low-cost, mass-produced, asymmetric threats. The economic model of conventional power projection is broken. An adversary, unable to compete symmetrically, is now mathematically incentivized to exploit this economic weakness. They are not forced to build a better tank. They are incentivized to mass-produce a cheaper counter. Every kinetic gamble by the declining power is met with a disproportionate, cost-effective response, forcing an escalatory spiral where launch-on-warning protocols become the only perceived option. The regional instability reported from theaters like Southern Africa is not random political decay. It is a strategic blueprint. These are gray zones, proxy laboratories designed for low-cost, high-leverage power projection. They are deliberately selected for their pre-existing fractures, making them ideal vectors for staging and stress-testing new forms of economic and kinetic warfare. As a hegemon's domestic solvency erodes, a liability underscored by Federal Reserve officials flagging a systemic housing crisis, source number 4, the capacity for symmetric warfare evaporates. A state that cannot afford its own infrastructure cannot afford a protracted, conventional war. This mirrors the Venezuela Protocol, source number 3. When internal economic viability collapses, external aggression becomes a distorted form of liquidity generation. This forces the adoption of high-leverage gambles. The establishment of forward military hubs, which provokes WB3 warnings, source number 2, and EU discussions on forming a combined force, source number 1, are not signals of strength. They are signals of economic desperation. For an adversary unable to compete symmetrically, the only logical counter is asymmetric escalation targeting the hegemon's core vulnerabilities. Therefore, these gray zones are not the battlefield. They are the Petri dish. Intelligence from authorities like CSIS indicates the next operational phase is the activation of these zones as launch pads. The laboratory becomes the weapon. This is the mathematical certainty when a solvency crisis dictates military protocol and initiates a launch-on-warning posture for all actors. The protocol governing nuclear exchange is known as launch-on-warning. According to strategic analysts at CSIS, it is not a policy of aggression, but of mathematical necessity. It dictates that a nation launches its retaliatory arsenal upon confirmation of an adversary's launch, before the incoming warheads can impact. The logic is zero-sum, to prevent one's own nuclear assets from being destroyed on the ground, thereby guaranteeing a second strike capability. This entire protocol, however, is built upon a single point of failure: the integrity of digital information. The early warning network of satellites and phased array radar is not a physical shield. It is a digital nervous system. An asymmetric cyber attack can sever this system, creating a total data blackout. The screens go dark. The commander is suddenly blind. This is the fog of digital war. The commander is now trapped by their own protocol. Is the blackout a simple system failure? Or is it a deliberate blinding action by an adversary to mask an incoming first strike? Waiting for verification risks the total annihilation of the nation's retaliatory force. To launch on the assumption of an attack is to initiate global thermonuclear war based on a digital ghost. The fear of being disarmed becomes the primary accelerant for launch. For a rival power, this is the ultimate high-leverage, low-kinetic cost gamble. It weaponizes the hegemon's own deterrence doctrine against itself. The systemic vulnerability is not in the missile silos, but in the fiber optic cables that connect them. The protocol becomes a liability, and the decision to launch is outsourced to fear. The response to a hegemon's kinetic overreach, source number 2, is never symmetric. Adversaries facing a decline in their own symmetric options, as noted by Rusi, do not plan for parity. They plan for leverage. They target the system's core liability, its reliance on frictionless data and trade flow, a vulnerability exacerbated by its domestic solvency crisis. Source number 4. This is not warfare, it is high-frequency economic attrition. The protocol for this countermove is clear. It must be a non-state attribution impossible event. It cannot be an act of war. It must be an accident with strategic consequences. The blueprint is designed to test the West's command and control response time outside of a formal military framework, a scenario for which the pending EU force, source number 1, is unprepared. Within the next 12 months, expect a multi-point cascading failure of transatlantic undersea data cables. This will not be a single cut, but a series of deep-sea seismic events or anchor drags in geographically dispersed, difficult-to-monitor locations. The resulting blackout of financial data will be framed as a natural catastrophe or freak accident. It is a calibration shot, engineered to measure the precise economic and political cost of kinetic escalation before a launch on warning posture becomes the default.